Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled that winter night, fierce and biting, as it swept across the small, isolated town where I had grown up. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones and made every breath feel sharp as if the very air was freezing inside your chest. The kind of night where the snow falls in thick, heavy sheets, covering everything in an eerie, quiet white. I was home for the holidays, staying at my family's old house on the outskirts of town. It had been a while since I had been there. The house had always felt a little too quiet, a little too still for my liking, but it was home. A grand old house built in the 1800s with creaking floors and dimly lit hallways. My parents had retired to the city, and I was left alone in the house for a few days, trying to catch up on some rest and reflect on the years that had passed since I'd left. That particular night, the storm had been raging for hours. The snow piled up quickly outside, covering the driveway and blocking the road, making the house feel even more isolated. I had decided to retire early. The fire in the hearth was crackling and warm, and I was looking forward to a peaceful night in bed. But something about the silence felt unnerving, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, feeling like I was being watched. My eyes flicked to the window, where the snowflakes danced in the dim glow of the streetlight outside. It was then that I heard it, a soft, slow, creaking sound from downstairs. I tried to convince myself that it was the house settling, the wind rattling the windows. After all, the house was old, and the sounds it made at night were familiar. But the creaking continued, followed by the faint sound of footsteps on the wooden floors below. My heart rate quickened. I lay still for a few moments, listening. The house had always been quiet at night, so it struck me as odd that there would be anyone moving around downstairs. The sound was too deliberate to be caused by the house itself. I sat up slowly, holding my breath, my eyes scanning the darkness of my room. The moonlight barely filtered through the curtains, but I could make out the faint shapes of furniture in the room. Everything seemed still, but the noise downstairs persisted, faint but unmistakable. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and texted my parents, though I knew they wouldn't be able to help. They lived hours away in the city, and I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid. But the feeling of being watched, the weight of the silence pressing in on me, was overwhelming. The footsteps continued. I could hear them moving down the hallway below me, growing louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to steady myself. The only other person who lived in the house was my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Simmons, who rarely left her place, but I knew she was too frail to move around at this hour. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to check. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from the drawer by my bedside. My heart thumped in my chest as I crept toward the door. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something wasn't right. I opened the door a crack, peering into the dark hallway. Everything was still. The shadows stretched along the walls like dark, elongated shapes. I stepped into the hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The house was cold, too cold for a winter night. I made my way down the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The front door was wide open. The wind howled through the open doorway, sending snow drifting inside, covering the floor in a thin layer of ice and snow. My heart raced. I hadn't opened the door, and neither had anyone else. The wind was so strong it seemed to carry a sort of whisper with it, a faint, unintelligible murmur that chilled me to the bone. The room seemed darker than it should have been, despite the light from the street lamp outside casting pale shadows through the open door. I stood there, staring at the door. My mind raced, trying to figure out what could have happened. Maybe I had left it ajar earlier when I was taking out the trash, but I was certain I hadn't. The house was always locked up tight when I went to bed. I was about to step forward to close the door when I heard the sound again, the soft, deliberate creaking of the floorboards behind me. My blood ran cold. I didn't need to turn around to know that I wasn't alone. A figure appeared at the edge of the doorframe. At first, it was a shadow, just a dark silhouette standing there in the doorway. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw the face. A pale, gaunt face, with hollow eyes and dark, stringy hair hanging down to the shoulders. The figure was dressed in tattered clothes, and I could see that the skin was stretched tight over the bones as if it hadn't eaten in years. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, neither of us moved. The figure just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes, as if it had been waiting for something, waiting for me. And then it moved. It didn't walk like a person. It glided across the floor, its feet never quite touching the ground. Its body was thin and stretched, and with every step, the floor groaned beneath it, the sound of the wood bending unnaturally. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot. The figure inched closer, its eyes fixed on me with an unblinking stare. When it was just inches away, it stopped. The air around me grew icy, and I could see my breath misting in the cold, a cold so deep it felt like the very essence of death itself had settled into the room. And then it whispered. Its voice was soft, almost a breath against my ear, but it was clear. "Get out." The words were chilling. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure stood there, its eyes never leaving mine, like its presence suffocating. Suddenly I was able to move. I stumbled backward, rushing to close the door, slamming it shut against the wind. My hands shook as I locked the door, pressing my back against it, heart pounding in my chest. The cold lingered, seeping into my skin. I turned around, expecting to see the figure still standing in the hall, but it was gone. The house was silent once again, but the weight of the encounter hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I couldn't. The house was too quiet now, too still. The next morning, I left the house and never returned. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. Something had been in that house that night, something not of this world, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon.
Story number 2.
The storm raged outside, howling and thrashing against the old farmhouse like a living thing. Snow fell in heavy sheets, drifting over the yard and up to the windows where it accumulated in thick layers. It was a winter midnight, and all was silent within the house except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the wind battering the sides of the building. Sarah sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a woolen blanket, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. She had moved to the countryside several months ago, seeking solace in the isolation. The house, though old, had been well maintained with its creaky floors, high ceilings, and large windows that let in the light. She had chosen this place for its solitude, away from the hustle of the city, hoping to find some peace after a long period of grief. Her husband, Ben, had passed away just over a year ago, and she had been struggling ever since. Ben had been the one to choose the house. He had always dreamed of living in the countryside, and Sarah had agreed, thinking it would be a good place to start over after everything had fallen apart. After his death, she couldn't bring herself to sell the house. It was all she had left of him, so she stayed. Tonight, as the snowstorm raged on, she felt an eerie stillness in the air. It was as if the world outside had frozen, as if time itself had stopped. She had always felt an odd sense of being watched in this house, but tonight it felt different, more intense. The silence was thick, oppressive. Her fingers wrapped around the rim of her teacup, and she took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling. She was just being paranoid, she thought. The house was old, and the storm outside only amplified the noises the house made. But there was something unsettling about the stillness, the way everything seemed to hold its breath. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. The fire crackled, sending out a burst of warmth. Sarah stared into the flames, lost in thought, when a soft sound made her freeze. A faint tapping. At first, she dismissed it, attributing it to the wind or the house settling, but then it came again, more distinct this time. A light tapping against the window. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she stood up, her legs trembling. The house was isolated, miles away from the nearest neighbor. No one should be outside in this storm, not at this hour. She crossed the room cautiously, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she approached the window. The wind howled outside, but the tapping persisted. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain and peered out into the darkness. The snow had piled high against the window, and the world beyond was a blur of white. She could see nothing. The tapping stopped. Sarah let out a shaky breath and stepped back from the window, her heart racing. She was being ridiculous. There was no one out there. The storm had likely made the noise. She had heard trees groaning and branches scraping against windows in the past. It was nothing. But as she turned to walk away, something caught her eye. A shadow. A figure moving outside just beyond the range of the window. It was only a silhouette, barely visible in the swirling snow, but it was there. For a moment, Sarah froze, her eyes wide in terror. The figure was moving toward the house. Her pulse quickened. There was no way anyone should be out there. Not in this storm. She grabbed the flashlight from the nearby table, her hands shaking as she fumbled to turn it on. She rushed to the front door, her breath catching in her throat. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the door and swung it open, stepping out into the biting cold. The snow was thick, swirling around her in the wind, but she could see nothing. The yard was empty, no sign of anyone. The wind was so loud now, almost deafening, and the cold cut through her clothes like knives. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her thoughts raced. Who could it have been? Was it just her imagination? She was about to step back inside when she heard it again, a soft, low whisper, coming from the shadows near the barn. She turned toward the sound, her flashlight beam shaking as she aimed it toward the barn. "Ben," she called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. She knew it was foolish, but the name escaped her lips before she could stop it. She hadn't said his name in months. Not since that day, the day of his funeral. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind. But she could feel the presence, an overwhelming sense that something was out there, watching her. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the snow, and when she reached the barn, she stood still for a long moment, listening. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. "Sarah!" Her heart lurched in her chest. She spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, the barn dark and silent. The snow continued to fall, blanketing everything in its path. "Ben?" she whispered again, this time a tear slipping down her cheek. She felt a shiver of cold, not from the storm, but from the sensation that she was no longer alone. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her breathing and the storm outside. Suddenly, the door to the barn creaked open. It was faint, barely perceptible, but Sarah heard it. She froze. The door to the barn should have been locked. She was sure she had locked it earlier that day, but now it was open, just a crack. Without thinking, she rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She flung the barn door wide, the hinges squealing in protest. The inside was dark, the only light coming from the flashlight in her hand. She stepped inside, her breath clouding in front of her as the cold seeped into her bones. And then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw him. Ben. It was him. His face, pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with an expression of sadness. He stood in the far corner of the barn, his figure shrouded in shadows. "Ben," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, Ben, is it really you?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Sarah took a step toward him, her hands trembling. She reached out to touch him, but as her fingers neared his arm, he vanished. Gone. Just like that. The barn was empty again, and the air was deathly still. Her breath came in ragged sobs as she stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She ran out of the barn and back to the house, slamming the door behind her, locking it tight. She sank to the floor, her mind racing, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Had it been a hallucination? Had she imagined the whole thing? The figure, the whisper, Ben's face? The storm outside raged on, but inside the house felt different, darker somehow. Sarah sat in the living room for the rest of the night, clutching the blanket around her, her mind swirling with questions. What had she seen? Was it really Ben's ghost? Or was it just her grief playing tricks on her? When the morning light finally broke through the storm, Sarah got up and walked to the barn. The door was still slightly ajar. She stepped inside cautiously, the air still cold, but there was no sign of the figure from the night before. The barn was empty, as it had always been, except for one thing. On the far wall, scratched deeply into the wood, were the words, "I'm sorry, Sarah. Please forgive me." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she placed her hand on the wooden wall. She didn't know if it was Ben's ghost or something else entirely, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened that night, whatever had come to her in the storm, it wasn't over. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm had come out of nowhere. I had just pulled into the small cabin in the woods after a long drive, and now the world outside was disappearing under a thick blanket of snow. The wind howled, a fierce wail that shook the trees and made the windows of the cabin rattle. I had rented the place for a few days to get away from the stress of city life, and despite the weather, I was determined to enjoy the solitude. The cabin was old, rustic, but comfortable, with a fireplace and a single room that seemed to absorb the sound of the storm outside. The night had fallen quickly. By the time I had unpacked and settled in, the wind was howling louder, and the snow had turned into a blizzard. There were no other houses in sight, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The idea of being in a secluded place like this should have felt peaceful, but something about the wind, the dark, and the emptiness outside made me uneasy. Still, I brushed off the feeling and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy my book and the quiet. Around midnight, I heard it, something creaking from upstairs. The cabin wasn't big, but the sound was loud enough to make me pause. The upstairs was just a small loft with a bed and a single window overlooking the snow-covered woods. It could have been the wind, I told myself, but then I heard it again, creak, creak, and it was closer this time, as if someone was walking around up there. I stood up from my chair, clutching my mug of tea. Maybe it was an animal that had somehow gotten inside, though that didn't seem likely, considering I had checked the cabin thoroughly when I arrived. I walked toward the stairs, my heart pounding a little faster than normal, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. I turned on the light, but the bulb flickered, casting an eerie glow over the stairs. The sound continued, soft, but unmistakable, someone or something moving around upstairs. I didn't want to go up there. I didn't want to check. But the more I stood there, the louder the creaks grew, as if whatever it was knew I was there, and it was taunting me. My feet moved before my brain could process it, and I found myself slowly ascending the stairs. My breath was coming faster, and my hands were clammy as I gripped the railing. The cabin was unnervingly silent between the creaks, the air thick with tension. I reached the top of the stairs and paused, my eyes scanning the dark loft. There was nothing. No one. I felt foolish. It must have been the wind or the house settling. There was no reason to be afraid. But the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered. I stepped further into the loft and approached the bed. The sheets were undisturbed. The small window was shut tightly, and the storm outside had created a soft hum against the glass. I turned to leave, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the bed there was a faint imprint, like the shape of a body had recently been there. The blankets were slightly disturbed, but there were no footprints leading in or out. I felt an involuntary chill, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The room had the feeling of being lived in, but I knew I was the only one there. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise, and moved back toward the stairs. Just as I reached the bottom, I heard the creak again. This time it was much closer, right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the emptiness of the cabin, the howling wind outside. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the door to the small pantry swung open on its own. I froze. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. The pantry door had been closed when I arrived, and it was only a small room with a few shelves and some old, unused items. I hadn't opened it since I'd come in. And yet, now it was swinging wide open. I don't know how long I stood there, but I could feel my legs trembling. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, almost deafening, and I could feel the cold seeping through the walls of the cabin. But I wasn't just cold from the storm. I was shivering with fear. Something was in here with me. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and moved cautiously toward the pantry. The door creaked as it swung back and forth, the dark void inside mocking me, daring me to look. I stood in the doorway for a moment, hesitating, my pulse quickening. It felt like an eternity before I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and nothing looked out of place. The shelves were lined with old cans, a few jars, and some random knickknacks left behind by the previous owners. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. I stood there for a long moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just the storm, the wind, my imagination running wild in the quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Just as I was about to turn and leave, The flashlight flickered. I pressed it tighter into my hand, trying to steady it, but it wouldn't stop shaking. I was too terrified to move, too terrified to make a sound. Then I heard it again, a soft whisper, so quiet I almost thought it was the wind. But it wasn't. It was a voice. Leave now. The voice was so faint, I thought I might have imagined it. But it came again, clearer this time. Leave now. The hairs on my neck prickled. My heart raced and I couldn't move. I stood there in the dark, paralyzed, as the whispering continued, getting louder and louder. Leave now. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran. I bolted out of the pantry, down the stairs, and straight for the door. I grabbed my coat and rushed outside into the storm, the cold biting at my skin as I ran through the snow. My legs were numb, my breath ragged, but I couldn't stop. I didn't stop until I reached the car. I scrambled inside and started the engine, hands shaking, and I pulled out of the driveway without a second thought, never once looking back at the cabin. The storm howled around me, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting away from that place. The next morning, I drove back into town to call the owner of the cabin. I told him what had happened, about the noises, the whispers, the strange imprint on the bed. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he didn't sound surprised. He told me the cabin had been built years ago, and there had been stories about strange occurrences in the area. He warned me that many people had experienced similar things, but no one ever stayed long enough to figure it out. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was there with me that night, but I don't care to find out. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The night was bitterly cold, the wind howling through the trees, twisting and turning like it was alive. Snowflakes spiraled down from the sky, settling on the ground in thick layers. It was one of those winter nights that felt like the world had frozen in place, still, silent, and heavy with an unnatural calm. I had been driving for hours through the remote countryside, hoping to make it to the small cabin I had rented for the weekend, a place I could escape to and find some peace. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had long set, and the darkness outside felt suffocating. The driveway was nearly invisible beneath the fresh snow, but I managed to navigate my way to the front porch. The cabin looked as if it had been abandoned for years, though I knew it had just been recently renovated. It was small, nestled in the woods with a stone chimney and a rickety porch swing. But there was something about it, something that didn't sit right. I shrugged it off. It was late, I was tired, and I was alone. I had rented the place because I wanted to be alone. I wanted solitude, and this cabin, isolated in the woods, was exactly what I needed. I grabbed my bags and trudged through the snow to the front door, where I noticed that the porch light flickered, struggling to stay on the storm. I fumbled with the key for a moment, then pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin hit me immediately, and the smell of wood and dust filled my nose. I closed the door behind me and set down my things. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace in the living room and a few old, mismatched pieces of furniture scattered around. The faint smell of something musty lingered in the air, but I didn't think much of it. It was an old cabin, after all. I lit the fireplace and set my bags down in the small bedroom off to the side. As the fire crackled to life, I decided to make myself a cup of tea and settle down with a book. The wind outside howled louder, and the snow began to fall harder. The sound of the storm outside was unsettling, but it wasn't the first snowstorm I'd been caught in. I had lived in cold places before, and it didn't bother me. But as the minutes passed, I started to notice the silence in the cabin. It was unnerving in a way I couldn't quite explain, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me and focused on the warmth of the fire. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passing of time. But then something caught my attention. A sound. Faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps. I sat up straighter, my breath coming a little quicker. The cabin was small. There were no other guests, no one else around, just me. I stood up, trying to convince myself it was nothing. It was probably the house settling, the old wood creaking. But no. These were distinct, rhythmic footsteps, someone walking across the floor upstairs. I moved toward the staircase, my mind racing. There was a small loft upstairs, just a few steps up, and the bedroom in the loft was the one I had planned to sleep in. I hadn't checked it when I arrived, so maybe there was a draft or something causing the sound. My nerves were getting the better of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps grew louder. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I walked toward the stairs. I hesitated at the bottom, listening. The steps had stopped for a moment, but then they resumed, slow, methodical, as if someone was pacing back and forth across the floor. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and slowly ascended the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and I felt a cold chill settle over me as I reached the top. The stairs led to a small loft area, a cozy little nook with a bed tucked against the wall. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fire below. I looked around, but there was nothing. No one. The footsteps had stopped. I stepped into the room, shining the flashlight around. The bed was neatly made, and everything seemed in place. There was no sign of anyone, but the floor felt cold beneath my feet, colder than it should have been given the warmth from the fire below. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. The snowstorm outside was relentless, but the cabin was still and quiet inside. I was about to leave the room when I saw it. A shadow just at the edge of the bed. It flickered for a split second, and then it was gone. I froze again, my blood running cold. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of the cabin, but I couldn't. Something was compelling me to stay. I turned slowly, the flashlight still in my hand, but as I looked around, I could feel it, a presence. Something in the room that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the doorway, I heard a whisper. Soft, so soft I could barely hear it. Leave. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The room was empty. I didn't wait another second. I ran down the stairs, grabbed my coat, and bolted out the door. The wind whipped against my face, stinging my skin, but I didn't care. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hardly catch my breath as I fumbled for the keys. The storm was blinding now, the snow swirling in every direction, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay there. Not after what had happened. I drove through the storm, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town hours later. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to think about the shadow in the room or the voice that had whispered to me. I knew I would never go back to that cabin. I didn't need to know what had been there or what it had wanted. But I still think about it sometimes. The feeling of being watched, the whisper in the dark. I don't know who or what was in that cabin with me, but I know I was never truly alone that night. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snow had fallen thick and heavy, transforming the small town into a winter wonderland. It was December 24th, and the night was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden house as it settled. Mark had spent the evening at his family's Christmas party, the laughter and warmth of the gathering, a sharp contrast to the harsh wind howling outside. But as the evening wore on, he felt the pull of home, his small cabin at the edge of town. It wasn't that he disliked the party or the people there, but something about the peace of his cabin called to him. The night had deepened, and at almost midnight, he decided it was time to go. He hugged his parents goodbye, tossed on his coat, and headed out into the biting cold. The wind was unforgiving, biting at his face as he walked the short distance to his car. The drive to his cabin wasn't long, just a few miles along a winding road that curved through the woods. The snow had piled up on the road, and it was difficult to see clearly, but Mark was used to it. He'd made this trip dozens of times before. As he drove, he couldn't help but notice how still the night was. The usual sounds of wildlife, even in winter, were absent. The forest was eerily quiet, the trees heavy with snow that hung in thick layers. He felt a strange unease creeping in, but he shrugged it off. It was probably just the late hour and the storm. Nothing to be afraid of. Halfway to his cabin, the headlights of his car flickered. Mark cursed under his breath, tapping the steering wheel. The engine sputtered and the lights dimmed again, this time completely. The car jerked to a halt, and Mark let out a frustrated sigh. He sat in the dark for a moment, the cold seeping in through the window cracks. The wind outside howled louder now, pressing against the car as if trying to push it away. "Great," Mark muttered, grabbing his phone to check for a signal. Of course, there was nothing, just a single bar that flickered in and out, offering no help. The storm had knocked out the service for miles. He stepped out of the car, pulling his coat tightly around himself. The snow was deep, and it had accumulated fast. He would need to walk the rest of the way. With a reluctant sigh, Mark locked the car and began trudging through the snow. The cold bit at his skin as he made his way down the road, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The wind howled in his ears, and he wished he hadn't left the party so early. He could have stayed longer, kept warm, and now he was out here alone in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but his flashlight to guide him. The walk to the cabin should have taken only 10 minutes, but it seemed to stretch out longer with every step. The woods around him felt oppressive. The trees close together, their branches heavy with snow that creaked and swayed. The air felt dense, like it was holding its breath. That's when he heard it. A faint sound, almost like the whisper of a voice. Mark stopped dead in his tracks, straining to hear. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned slowly, scanning the trees behind him. There was no one. The woods were empty, the storm muffling any sounds that might have come from further away. He shook his head, trying to rationalize it. Yes, it was just the wind, or maybe a deer, or his mind playing tricks on him. But as he continued walking, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt a prickling sensation across his skin. When he finally reached his cabin, he quickly opened the door, stepping inside and slamming it shut behind him. He locked it, a strange sense of urgency making his hands shake. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a wave, and he exhaled a sigh of relief. The fire was still crackling in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was quiet now, peaceful, just as it should be. But then, as he stood there for a moment, catching his breath, he heard the whisper again. This time, it was clearer. A soft, almost melodic voice calling his name. Mark. His blood ran cold. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. The shadows danced on the walls, the firelight flickering, but everything seemed normal. He was alone. It must have been the storm. His mind was playing tricks again. He hadn't had much sleep lately, and the long drive had worn him out. But then, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Mark could see his breath in the air, misting in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved toward the fire, hoping the warmth would return. As he approached the hearth, he heard a soft rustling behind him. He whipped around, but there was nothing, just the empty cabin, the fire crackling in the corner. "Okay, this is ridiculous," Mark muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "I'm just tired. It's the storm, the cold, that's all." But then the whisper came again. This time it was closer. "Mark?" The voice was not just a whisper anymore. It was a low, almost desperate murmur, like someone speaking just behind him. He spun around, his eyes wide, but there was no one. The cabin was still empty, if the fire casting its warm glow across the room. But as he looked toward the far corner, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the shadows, just at the edge of the firelight, stood a figure, a woman. Her face was pale, gaunt, her long black hair hanging limp around her face. She was dressed in a tattered white gown, and her eyes were hollow, black pools of darkness that seemed to pierce through him. Mark couldn't move. His legs felt like stone, frozen in place. His heart hammered in his chest, every instinct telling him to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The woman stepped closer, her feet barely making a sound as she moved across the floor. The room seemed to grow colder with each step she took. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps, the air around him thick with dread. Who are you?" He managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came from them. She raised a hand, pointing toward the window, her finger trembling in the air. Mark's gaze followed her finger, but all he could see through the window was the blizzard raging outside. When he looked back at her, she was gone. The room was empty again. Mark's knees buckled and he collapsed to the floor, his heart still racing. His breath was shallow, his whole body trembling with fear. What the hell had just happened? He stumbled to his feet, his hands shaking as he reached for the door. He had to get out of there. The storm be damned. He couldn't stay another minute. But before he could unlock the door, he heard it again. The whisper. Mark. This time it was right behind him. He spun around, his eyes wild, but the cabin was still empty. The fire still crackled, the wind howling outside, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly. He was alone, but that voice, it was still there. Mark. The voice echoed in his ears, and his knees gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, staring at the empty room. He wasn't alone, though. He never had been. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The winter of 2018 had been particularly brutal. I remember that night distinctly because it was one of the coldest I'd experienced in my life, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, no matter how many layers you put on. I had just finished my shift at a small 24-hour convenience store on the outskirts of town and was heading home in my car. The wind howled through the streets, whipping up snow in the dim streetlights as I drove down the lonely road that led to my apartment. I didn't mind the isolation of the drive. It gave me time to think, to relax after a long shift. But that night, something felt different. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess the shadows in the corner of your eye. As I rounded the last bend before reaching my apartment complex, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes, a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, perhaps a snowdrift or a tree branch casting a strange shadow. But then I realized it was a person standing at the edge of the road. They were tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, and appeared to be just staring. No movement. No reaction to the car's headlights. I blinked, trying to focus. But when I looked again, they were gone. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was tired, and the cold was beginning to get to me. I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks. So I drove on, parked in my usual spot, and hurried inside to the warmth of my apartment. The next few days passed uneventfully. The snow continued to fall, and the roads stayed treacherous. I had nearly forgotten about the strange figure on the road when it happened again. The next time I was coming home after a late shift, I saw the figure once more. This time, they were standing at the same spot near the bend in the road, staring into the dark forest. I slowed down, unsure whether to stop, but when I looked away for just a moment to check my mirrors, they vanished again. It was then that I felt it, the cold, creeping dread that started in the pit of my stomach and crawled up to my chest. It wasn't just the bitter winter air. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. I knew how crazy it sounded, a figure that appeared out of nowhere, only to vanish when you looked away. But after the third night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was there, just beyond the reach of my vision. It was starting to consume me. I decided to take a different route home that night, hoping to avoid the spot where I'd seen the figure. The roads were slick with ice, and the snow was falling harder than ever. As I neared the turnoff, I slowed down just in case. But there, at the edge of the road, was the figure again. This time, it wasn't just standing still. It was walking, slowly, deliberately, toward my car. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the figure approach. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could see the outline of the person clearly now. They were moving toward me with an unnatural calmness, their bodies swaying slightly as they walked, as though they were drifting rather than walking. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, too terrified to drive away, too frozen by fear to move. The figure reached the edge of my car, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought they might touch the window. But then, just as before, they vanished. This time, I didn't hesitate. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, fishtailing slightly on the icy road as I sped toward my apartment complex. When I finally reached the safety of my parking lot, I didn't even bother to turn off the engine. I just sat there, my breath coming in short gasps, my hands trembling. I couldn't stay in the apartment that night. I didn't know why, but I just couldn't. So I drove around aimlessly, hoping the movement would calm my racing thoughts. After an hour or so, I found myself on a winding back road that led deeper into the woods. I wasn't sure why I went there, but I felt drawn to it, as if something was pulling me to the edge of the trees. I stopped the car at the side of the road and turned off the engine. The forest loomed in front of me, dark and foreboding, the snow now falling in thick, silent flakes. As I sat there, a strange feeling settled over me, a feeling of being watched. I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me, though there was no one in sight. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind. A whisper. Not from behind me, but from the forest. It was my name. Clear as day. Lena. I whipped around, my heart racing. There was no one there, of course, but the whisper had been so real, so close, that I could have sworn someone had spoken it directly into my ear. I didn't wait around to investigate. I floored the gas pedal and sped back toward town, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road behind me was empty. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I locked every door and window, even the ones that didn't need locking. I sat on the couch, trembling with fear, staring into the darkness. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to find out what was happening, what this figure was, why it kept appearing. The next morning, I took a chance and reached out to an older woman in town, a friend of my grandmother's who had lived there her entire life. I didn't know if she'd believe me, but I was desperate for answers. Her name was Clara, and when I told her my story, she was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, she spoke. "Sounds like you've met him," she said, her voice low and steady. "Met who?" I asked, a chill running through me. "The man who died on that road many years ago. They say his spirit still wanders. A tragedy, really. He was killed in a car accident on a cold winter night. No one ever saw what happened to him, but they say his spirit has never left. He appears to people, draws them out into the woods. It's the cold, you see. The cold is what keeps him there, frozen in time." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "But why me?" Clara's eyes softened. "Some say he targets those who are alone, lost, or vulnerable. He calls to them, but you're not the first to hear him, and you won't be the last." That night, I didn't see the figure again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting in the shadows, calling my name. And every winter since, when the snow falls heavily and the wind howls through the trees, I can't help but remember that voice. The one that called to me in the cold, in the dark of midnight.
Story number 7.
The night was bitterly cold. As winter set in, the wind howled through the barren trees, sending snowflakes spiraling in every direction. Alex had been driving for over an hour, trying to make his way back to his small cottage on the outskirts of town. He had just finished a long shift at the diner, and the thought of being home, curled up by the fire, was the only thing that kept him going. The road was mostly deserted, the occasional passing car already long gone by the time it reached him. He could barely see the headlights of his car cutting through the dense snowstorm, and the windshield wipers were struggling to keep up with the thickening snow. He slowed down, feeling uneasy in the desolate landscape. His radio was silent, except for the occasional static, and he had no real sense of time. He hadn't wanted to leave the warmth of the diner, but the promise of his bed had been enough to convince him. Alex had grown accustomed to this long drive, having lived out here for almost 3 years now. It was peaceful, quiet, but in moments like this, it could also feel eerily lonely. As he reached a particularly dark stretch of the road, his car's engine sputtered. He frowned, tapping the steering wheel in frustration. The car gave one final cough before completely dying, and the headlights flickered out. Alex sat there in the complete darkness, the only sound being the relentless howling of the wind. "Great," he muttered to himself, grabbing his phone. No signal. Of course. He tried turning the key again, hoping it would work, but nothing happened. Alex cursed under his breath. The nearest gas station was at least a half hour away, and he wasn't sure he wanted to try walking through the snowstorm, especially at this hour. But he had no choice. He got out of the car, zipping up his jacket as the cold air bit at his skin. The road was desolate, nothing but endless trees lining either side. He pulled his hood up and started walking, hoping to find some shelter, or perhaps an abandoned house where he could wait for help. The snowstorm intensified as he trudged through the deepening snow, his boots sinking with every step. The wind made the air feel even colder, and his face was quickly numb. About 20 minutes into his walk, Alex noticed something strange. In the distance, beyond the trees, a faint light flickered. He squinted, wondering if it was a street lamp or perhaps another car that had broken down like him. The light looked warm, and for a moment it was the most inviting thing he had seen all night. He picked up his pace, hoping that whatever it was, it would bring him closer to warmth and shelter. As he got closer, the light became clearer. A small house nestled in the woods. There was a lantern hanging from the porch, swaying gently in the wind, casting an eerie yellow glow over the snow. Alex hesitated. It was strange to see a house out here. He didn't think there were any homes in this area. But the cold was unbearable, and the warmth inside would be a relief. He approached cautiously, knocking softly on the wooden door. "Hello?" he called. His voice was swallowed by the wind. No answer. He knocked again, this time louder. "Is anyone home?" Still no response. He reached for the doorknob, testing it. To his surprise, it turned easily, the door creaking open as though inviting him inside. Reluctantly, he stepped over the threshold and into the dimly lit room. The inside was just as warm as he had hoped, with a fireplace crackling in the corner. A single chair sat by the hearth, rocking slowly back and forth as if someone had just gotten up and left. Alex closed the door behind him. The wind outside suddenly muffled as it was blocked by the sturdy walls. He took a few steps further into the room, trying to shake off the cold. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, the scent immediately comforting. The cabin was small but cozy, with old-fashioned furniture that seemed to belong to a different era. The walls were lined with photographs, most of them black and white. Alex glanced at them briefly, but one photo caught his eye. A woman standing in front of a house similar to the one he was in, her expression serene but somehow distant. "Hello?" Alex called again, this time louder. "Is anyone here?" The house was still. The only sound was the soft crackling of the fire. He felt uneasy, but the warmth was too inviting to turn back now. He sat down on the chair by the fire, rubbing his hands together to warm them. A few minutes passed, and he began to feel his limbs thawing, the heat from the fire reaching deep into his bones. His thoughts began to wander, and he closed his eyes for a moment, just to relax. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "Are you lost?" Alex jumped, his heart racing. He turned around quickly, his eyes scanning the room for the source of the voice. There, standing in the doorway of a small bedroom, was a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her long dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes dark but hollow, like she hadn't seen daylight in years. Alex's mouth went dry. Who are you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, staring at him, her gaze fixed but somehow vacant. After a long pause, she finally spoke again. "Don't stay here too long. You shouldn't have come." Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it felt like it echoed in the room. Alex stood up from the chair, suddenly feeling very out of place. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. My car broke down and The woman raised a hand, cutting him off. Her fingers were long and thin, and her skin looked almost translucent. "You're not the first," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "You won't be the last." Alex's heart pounded in his chest as his thoughts raced. He wanted to run, but his legs felt heavy. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly, and the fire that had once been so warm now seemed to offer little comfort. He took a step back toward the door, but the woman moved before him, blocking his path. "Don't go," she said, her voice more insistent now. "It's too late." Alex felt a chill run through him, a coldness that seemed to penetrate to the very marrow of his bones. He took another step backward, but the woman's gaze never wavered. Her hollow eyes bore into him, and for a moment it felt as though the room was closing in. "I have to go," Alex said, his voice trembling. "Please, I just need to get out of here." The woman remained silent, her expression unreadable. But as he reached for the door, the faintest sound echoed in the room, the creak of the rocking chair. He glanced over, and for a brief moment he could have sworn he saw the chair moving on its own, rocking back and forth. Suddenly, the room grew colder still. The fire flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Alex's breath came in shallow, visible gasps. With his heart in his throat, he pushed the door open and ran outside into the snowstorm, the wind slapping his face as he stumbled through the thick snow. His only thought was to escape. He didn't stop until he reached the road, his heart still racing. The wind howled around him, but he didn't care. His car was still dead, but he didn't need it anymore. As he turned around to look at the house, his breath catching in his throat, he saw the woman standing in the window, watching him. The lantern on the porch swung gently in the wind, casting eerie shadows against the snow. He never went back. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was the winter of 2014 when I first experienced something that still haunts me to this day. I was living in a small apartment on the outskirts of a quiet town, a place far from the bustle of city life. The area was beautiful, especially in winter when the snow blanketed the streets in a thick, pristine layer. But it also had a certain stillness, a silence that sometimes felt too heavy, too unnatural. I worked nights at a local diner. My shifts would end late, around midnight, when the streets were mostly empty, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional car passing by. One particular night, it had been especially quiet. A heavy snowstorm had begun earlier in the evening, and by the time I locked the diner doors and stepped outside, the world was blanketed in white. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that numbed your face almost immediately. I hurried to my car, eager to get home, but something caught my eye. At the end of the street, I saw a figure standing in the distance, just barely visible through the snow. I couldn't make out any details at first, but the person was standing still, as though waiting for something or someone. I figured they were just another late-night wanderer, or maybe someone lost in the storm. I didn't think much of it and kept walking toward my car, hoping the figure would move out of my path. As I fumbled for my keys in my pocket, I glanced up again. The figure hadn't moved. It was still standing in the same spot, and this time it felt wrong. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like the space itself was distorted, and I could swear that the figure wasn't there one moment and then suddenly was in the next. It felt like time itself had hiccuped, like the figure had appeared out of nowhere. My heart began to race, and an uneasy feeling crept over me. I quickly unlocked my car, got inside, and started the engine. The windshield wipers cleared the heavy snow as I pulled away, but my eyes kept darting back to where the figure had been. It wasn't there anymore. I breathed a sigh of relief, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks in the cold, the snowstorm, the isolation. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. My headlights cast a long beam of light ahead of me, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the swirling snow. And yet, deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I arrived at my apartment complex a few minutes later, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The parking lot was deserted as usual. I parked in my spot and, against my better judgment, checked the rearview mirror one last time. Nothing. But as I looked out the front window, I noticed something strange. A shadow moving along the far side of the lot, moving in and out of view behind the parked cars. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was too tall to be a streetlight, and it didn't move like a person. It drifted, more like a wisp of smoke or mist, floating and weaving between the vehicles. I didn't even wait for my car to come to a full stop. I threw the door open and bolted toward the entrance of the building, the snow crunching loudly beneath my feet. As I ran, I glanced back over my shoulder. The shadow had stopped, now hovering at the edge of the parking lot, but it didn't approach. It just lingered. I reached my apartment door, hurriedly unlocked it, and slammed it shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I double-checked the locks, flicked on all the lights, and finally collapsed onto the couch, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the storm messing with my mind. But there was something about the way that shadow had moved. It wasn't normal. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the image of that shadow kept creeping into my mind. I was exhausted, but my body refused to relax. I stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows dance in the dim light from the street lamp outside, when I heard it. A soft knock at the door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It was just after 2 a.m., too late for anyone to be visiting. I waited, thinking maybe it was just the wind or a car's engine causing vibrations. But then, there it was again, a soft, deliberate knock, as though someone was waiting for me to answer. I slowly got up and tiptoed toward the door, my breath shallow and fast. "Who is it?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. No answer, just silence. I stood there for a few moments, too afraid to open the door. Something in the air felt off. Then a sudden chill swept over me, despite the fact that the heat was on. I slowly crept over to the peephole and looked out. No one. but the faint outline of a shadow still lingering in the hallway was visible. It was far too tall to be a person standing outside my door. I couldn't make sense of it. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, and before I could process what was happening, the knock came again, louder this time, followed by an unsettling scraping sound. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, but there was nowhere to go. The windows were too high for me to climb out of, and the hallways were empty. I grabbed my phone, fingers shaking, but when I checked the time, it was just after 3 a.m. I quickly dialed my best friend, hoping she would answer. It went straight to voicemail. I texted her, telling her that something was wrong and that I needed help, but I didn't know if she would receive it or if it would even matter. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like time was running out. Then the knocking stopped. The shadow was gone, and everything fell eerily silent. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, but nothing happened. Minutes passed. No one came. The next morning I woke up to bright sunlight pouring through the window, the warmth of the sun a sharp contrast to the cold chill of the night before. I checked the door and the hallway, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I never saw the shadow again, and I never heard that knock again, but I knew something had been there. It wasn't just the snowstorm playing tricks on my mind. It was something else, something that had been waiting, watching. To this day, I still don't know what I saw, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that something was trying to make contact with me that night, that something had followed me home from that lonely street, from that empty parking lot. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear the faintest knocking at the door. And though I never open it, I wonder what might be standing just outside waiting for me to answer. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The wind howled through the trees, its eerie whistle carrying across the barren landscape. The snow was thick, covering the ground in a blanket of white, making everything appear ghostly and still. The world outside was asleep, blanketed by the dark and cold of winter, but in that moment, something else stirred. Claire pulled the thick woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders and glanced nervously at the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. It was just after midnight, and the house creaked with the cold. The clock struck 12 with a deep, resounding chime, making Claire's heart skip a beat. She glanced at the window, where the wind howled louder, rattling the panes as though trying to get inside. Her parents had gone away for the weekend, leaving Claire alone in the house. The old farmhouse, a crumbling relic of years past, stood isolated at the edge of the forest. Her friends had warned her not to stay here by herself, but she had insisted. She needed the time alone to study for finals, to finish the work that had been piling up in her life. It seemed peaceful enough, or so she thought. The house, however, had a way of giving off strange vibes, an unsettling atmosphere that Claire couldn't shake. Strange noises would echo in the middle of the night, and sometimes she thought she saw fleeting shadows at the edges of her vision. She dismissed them as figments of her imagination, the result of the overactive thoughts of someone alone in an old creaky house. But tonight, something felt different. There was a chill in the air that made her uneasy, more than just the biting cold of winter. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Claire tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the pages blurred as her thoughts raced. The sound of footsteps above her startled her. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around in the attic. She sat frozen, holding her breath. No one was supposed to be up there. Her parents had left no reason for anyone to be in the attic, and certainly no one had arrived since. But the sound of footsteps continued, slow, dragging with the weight of someone tired or burdened. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the continued shuffling above her. With a deep breath, Claire forced herself to stand up. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and cautiously moved toward the stairs. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat reverberating in her ears as she ascended the creaking steps toward the attic. The footsteps stopped as soon as her foot hit the bottom step. Claire hesitated, the silence deafening, her mind racing with possibilities. Perhaps it was just the wind, or the house settling after the cold night. But as she reached the top of the stairs, the door to the attic creaked open on its own. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't touched the door. Claire reached out with trembling hands and pushed it open, her heart in her throat. The attic was dark, save for the pale light of the moon that filtered through a small, grimy window. Dust motes floated lazily in the air undisturbed by time. The room was empty, save for a few old boxes and broken furniture. No one was there. She stepped inside, scanning the dim room for any sign of movement. Her eyes settled on an old rocking chair by the window, which began to rock gently back and forth. It was an unnatural motion, as though it had been disturbed recently. Her body froze, every instinct screaming at her to leave, to run. But she couldn't. Something pulled her forward toward the chair. As she neared it, the temperature dropped, her breath becoming visible in the cold air. The chair rocked faster now, in time with her quickening heartbeat. And then she saw it, a figure in the far corner of the room, the shape of a woman, but not quite. She was translucent, her outline blurred like smoke, her face pale and drawn with sadness. The figure was dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, its fabric torn and frayed. Her hair hung loose around her face, matted with something dark, almost as though it had been stained. Claire's pulse raced. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The figure did not answer, but the air around Claire thickened with a sense of dread. The temperature continued to plummet, and Claire could see her own breath fogging in the air. The woman in the corner moved then, slowly, her feet dragging across the floor. She didn't seem to walk so much as glide, her feet barely touching the floor. The sound of her shuffling echoed in the silence, louder than the wind howling outside. Claire couldn't move, her legs frozen to the spot, her body locked in terror. The woman's eyes, hollow and black, stared at her with an intensity that made Claire's skin crawl. "Please," Claire gasped, her throat tightening. "Leave me alone." The figure didn't respond, but as Claire watched, it raised one hand, pointing at her. The motion was deliberate, slow, as though the spirit were trying to communicate something. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and Claire could see her breath freezing in the air. The attic seemed to grow darker, the shadows twisting unnaturally. She turned toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to run. But the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The woman took a step closer. Her mouth opened in a slow, unnatural smile, revealing teeth that were sharp and broken, jagged like shards of glass. Claire's body trembled, and the air seemed to thicken around her. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. The woman's voice was a rasping whisper, as though it had come from far away, distorted by time and pain. She didn't listen. Claire didn't understand the words, but the coldness that flooded her body made it clear she wasn't meant to. She reached for the door handle again, desperately twisting it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. She pressed her body against the door, the fear tightening her chest. The woman's eyes locked onto her, and Claire felt a pull, deep, powerful. A force drawing her toward the woman. She felt her legs begin to move on their own, each step toward the figure like walking in deep mud. Her feet felt heavy, like something was holding her back, but still she moved forward. Her mind screamed to stop, to break free, but it was as if the house itself was pushing her forward. "Please, don't," she whispered again, but her voice was drowned out by the growling wind. The woman's smile grew wider, the air around her pulsating with energy. Claire was inches away from the figure now. The woman's hand reached out, and as it touched Claire's arm, an icy cold surged through her body. It felt as though her veins had frozen solid, her skin turning to stone. With a final, desperate effort, Claire threw herself away from the woman. The door burst open, and she tumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The temperature outside the attic was still cold, but the chilling weight that had pressed against her chest was gone. Panting heavily, Claire ran down the stairs, through the darkened hall, and into the living room. She collapsed onto the couch, still shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind outside howled louder now, but inside, everything was quiet. She stayed there, clutching the couch, eyes wide in terror, listening for any sound. But there was nothing. The rest of the night passed in a daze, with Claire unable to close her eyes. She didn't sleep a wink, even as the sky brightened with the pale light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, Claire rushed to the attic again, but the rocking chair had stopped moving, and the room was as it had been before. The figure was gone, but Claire knew what she had seen. The house had never felt the same again. The shadow of the woman in the attic would always remain, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The wind howled through the trees, a chilling reminder of the harshness of winter that had settled in for good. It was a crisp, frigid night, the kind where your breath would freeze in midair, hanging like a mist around your face. I was driving along the lonely country road that led to my family's cabin, a small, secluded place nestled deep in the woods. It was a place I had spent many winters, but this time, something felt different. I had grown up in a bustling city, but after my mother passed away, I found solace in this cabin, a place where my family had made memories for generations. That year, I had decided to spend Christmas alone there, seeking some peace and quiet in the middle of nowhere. I hadn't expected the cabin to be quite as isolated as it was. No neighbors for miles, just the dense forest surrounding me on all sides. The roads were slippery with ice, and I was driving slowly, making sure to stay on the cleared path. The snow was coming down heavily, and the headlights barely cut through the white haze. My phone had no signal, and I had no intention of turning back, even though I felt a growing unease. As I reached the driveway, I noticed that the cabin's lights weren't on, which was strange because I was certain I had left them on before I left for town earlier that evening. But I brushed it off as just a small malfunction with the generator or the old wiring in the cabin. I parked the car and grabbed my bags, making my way through the thick snow to the door. The air was still, save for the rustling of tree branches swaying in the wind. The moment I stepped inside, I was greeted by a sudden, overpowering silence, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. I called out, expecting to hear my own voice echo back, but there was no reply. I wasn't sure why I had expected someone else to be there. There hadn't been anyone with me in weeks. The silence didn't feel peaceful, though. It felt heavy, as though something was watching me. I turned on the lights and began to unload my things. The firewood was already stacked by the fireplace, so I decided to light a fire. The flames quickly grew, casting a warm glow across the room, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. I brushed it off again, telling myself that it was the quiet of the winter night that had me on edge. I was alone. I was safe. It wasn't until midnight that things began to take a turn. I had made myself a cup of hot cocoa and sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with a book. The wind outside was picking up, and I could hear the occasional branch scrape against the cabin's windows. I had grown accustomed to the noises of the woods, but there was something different about tonight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone in the cabin. Suddenly, I heard something. A faint sound, almost like footsteps. They were coming from upstairs. I froze. My heart began to race, and my breath caught in my throat. There was no reason for anyone to be upstairs. I was the only one there. Maybe the old house was just settling, I thought. But the sound persisted, slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to move back and forth along the hallway upstairs. I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. It had to be the wind. It had to be the house. But the sound of the footsteps wasn't random. It wasn't the creaking of old wood. It was something more, intentional. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the air, and a shiver ran down my spine. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I grabbed the flashlight from the table next to me and slowly stood up, my legs trembling. I moved toward the staircase, my footsteps hesitant and quiet, trying not to disturb whatever was making its way through the cabin. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel the presence, lingering in the air. It was as though someone or something was just out of sight, waiting. I mustered all the courage I could and slowly ascended the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and my heart pounded in my ears. At the top of the stairs, I paused again, listening intently. There was a door at the end of the hall that led to the guest room. It was always kept closed, just as my mother had kept it when I was a child. She had always said that it was a room for guests, never meant to be disturbed. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't want to look inside. I didn't want to know what I might see. But something compelled me to take a step forward, to push the door open just enough to peer inside. There was nothing. The room was empty, just as it had always been, with its faded wallpaper and worn furniture. But then, as I looked closer, I saw it. On the floor by the bed was a small patch of freshly fallen snow. I blinked, confused. The window was shut tight, and there had been no snow when I'd arrived. The patch of snow wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. It was fresh, untouched, as if someone or something had tracked it in just moments before I had entered the room. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. It was not the chill of the winter air, but something far colder, far more sinister. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The footsteps returned. This time they were right behind me. I ran. I ran back downstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to see if anything was following me. I bolted for the door and threw it open, the wind whipping through the opening, cold and biting. I didn't care. I ran out into the snow, my breath coming in sharp gasps, the crunch of my boots in the snow the only sound that filled my ears. I don't know how long I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the road, my body frozen and numb. I turned back to look at the cabin, but it was dark now. The lights extinguished, the window where I had seen the snow, now dark. I never returned to the cabin after that night. I couldn't bring myself to go back, not after what happened. It wasn't the footsteps or the snow or even the coldness that lingered in the air. It was the feeling that something was waiting for me there, something that had been there long before I arrived and would be there long after I left. Story the end.